Superman has been featured in dozens of video games dating all the way back to the Atari 2600, where he made his first officially licensed debut in 1978. As technology and video game consoles evolved, so did the depth, complexity, and in most cases, the quality of Superman titles. Superman: The New Adventures, or as it's more commonly referred to, Superman 64, wasn't set to be released until 1999, but Eric Kahn, the founder of its developer Titus Software, had already begun hyping up the game in interviews the year before its release. Superman 64 was previewed at 1998's E3, and afterwards, many expected a critically acclaimed hit. Instead, 1999's Superman 64 turned out to be one of the most poorly reviewed games of the year, if not all time. So how did a very publicly previewed game fall so short of everyone's expectations? Today we're going to take a look at how Warner Brothers and a French video game developer digitally depowered the Man of Steel. This is the story behind the making of Superman 64, quite possibly the worst Nintendo 64 game of all time. According to Eric Kahn, Superman 64's life began when the company heard rumblings from their LA office that Warner Brothers was preparing a new animated series based on Superman. Eric decided to try to obtain the licensing rights for Titus to create a new Superman game, even though he didn't think they would be able to do so. Kahn said, "They asked me 3 times if I was sure of what I was doing. No one else was interested enough in Superman to do a video game about it." Kahn supervised the development of 3 Superman games, each on a separate console: the Nintendo 64, the Game Boy, and the PlayStation, though that version would never see the light of day. Kahn wanted to develop a 3D open-world game in which Superman could do more than just fight enemies. Superman would be able to fly literally anywhere, and the game would also include each one of his superpowers, as well as various ways to use them against enemies and in conjunction with the environment. It was an ambitious undertaking that would push the Nintendo 64 to its limits and required the patience and trust from DC and Warner Brothers. But Kahn was used to dreaming big. At 19 years of age, he gave up his college education to gamble on founding Titus Software with his brother, and here he was, 14 years later, beginning development on a game for one of the most iconic and beloved comic book characters of all time. During negotiations for the Superman license, Eric had fostered a strong relationship with the Warner Brothers licensing team. Creatively and professionally, Superman 64 was set up for success. Then, shortly after their deal was signed, the team that had worked to bring Titus Software the rights to Superman was fired. In a 2015 interview, Kahn said, "The next people in charge hated us the first minute they saw us and our project. They believed that major companies such as EA Games would pay more and create a better product. And that's when the trouble began." Titus Software may not have been as big as EA Games, but that's not to say that they weren't a competent and experienced developer. They had already released over 30 games prior to Superman 64, including a few other licensed properties. Unfortunately, the people that Titus would be working with from Warner Brothers going forward either didn't know of Titus' history in the gaming industry or just didn't care. Titus wanted to create a large, open world for Superman to fly through and battle enemies in. Warner Brothers, on the other hand, wanted Titus to change the game from an action-adventure game to a SimCity-like game in which Superman would take on the role of the mayor of Metropolis. Kahn dismissed that idea, and while he may have won that battle, Warner Brothers were about to start the war. Warner Brothers seemingly questioned every idea the developer had and micromanaged the project to the point where it seemed that they were deliberately trying to slow down development of the game. It took months just to get each character that they wanted to use approved. Warner Brothers would frequently say that Superman would never do that, when arguing decisions that Kahn and his team had made for Superman in the game. Titus found themselves in the strange position of having to prove things like Superman's ability to swim through water as easily as he can fly through the air by providing Warner Brothers with Superman comic book references, including the year, issue, and page number. The meddling even affected the overall plot of the game. You see, Superman 64 doesn't take place in the real Metropolis. Instead, it takes place in a virtual version of it that Lex Luthor created to trap Lois Lane and others inside of, and it's up to Superman to save them. So why didn't Titus just have Luthor trap Superman's friends in the real Metropolis? Why did they create this weird, convoluted virtual reality plot in which Superman has to fly through rings and collect some of his powers in order to use them? Eric Kahn explained that Warner Brothers didn't want Superman to beat up quote-unquote real people. despite the fact that Superman had been doing so for decades in comic books, movies, and would continue doing so in the upcoming Superman animated series that Warner Brothers themselves were producing. Warner Brothers also took issue with Superman having the ability to destroy so much of the game's environment, arguing that Superman couldn't, quote, act as a bad person, and that's how the idea for a virtual metropolis came to be. Here, any cars, walls, or people that Superman might destroy wouldn't be real. This may have satisfied Warner Brothers, but the time that it took to make these changes only served to take time away from other areas of the game's development, and it would show. Titus had promised large, expansive levels that Superman would be able to fly around in, but when Superman 64 was released, the majority of the levels were small and didn't even require flying. The infamous flying ring tutorial levels do put Superman's flying front and center, but the poor controls make what should have been one of the best parts of the game, Superman's ability to fly, a tedious task at best. Khan has stated that the rings were always supposed to be in the game, but not to the extent or repetitive nature in which they appeared in the final product. The rest of the game didn't fare much better. Fog was used to mask the fact that the game wasn't optimized to let the Nintendo 64 have much of a draw distance for the environment. It's also easy for Superman to get stuck on buildings, go through walls, and even get stuck in the floor. In short, it was full of bugs. Eric blames the majority of the glitches and other problems with Superman 64 squarely on Warner Brothers. In an interview with Playboy, he said, "We lost too much time answering Warner Brothers and DC's concerns and weird ideas. With more time to focus on the game's development and its playability, we could have improved the controls and made a better game at the end." The constant retooling required by Warner Brothers led to Titus missing the original marketing deadline by 6 months. It's safe to say that Warner Brothers' constant interference and strange requirements were the main reason why Superman 64 turned out to be one of the worst Nintendo 64 games of all time. In spite of all of the issues that it had during its development, portions of the game shown at E3 1998 were positively received, and Superman 64 was still a highly anticipated title. The reason for the anticipation wasn't just innocent fan interest for a fully 3D Superman title. You see, as villainous as Khan and Titus Software have portrayed Warner Brothers to be, they weren't exactly innocent themselves. Eric Khan has made it clear in numerous interviews that Warner Brothers interfered and hampered Superman 64's development from the very beginning. Yet, in interviews as late as May of 1998, about 3 months before the game would be finished, Khan spoke about the complexity of the collision system and background interaction and destruction elements of the game engine, all the while knowing that Superman would be in a largely indestructible virtual metropolis full of collision glitches. He stated that optimizations would be completed so that the game could run over 20 frames per second, but those optimizations never came. He downplayed the restrictive nature of some levels when it came to flying, and touted being able to use all of Superman's powers, even though you wouldn't really have them to use at your disposal whenever you wanted. He described the game as really original and really cool to play. Now, to be fair, Eric was in a tough spot. He knew Superman 64 wasn't going to be a great game, but as the head of its developer, he couldn't exactly go out and publicize its issues in interviews. However, that doesn't make some of the statements he and Titus made about the game any less misleading, particularly when so many of those statements were made so close to the game being finished.
Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen have been kidnapped. Who will save the day? You are Superman. All the powers are yours. Flight, heat vision, super speed, super strength, freezing breath, and X-ray vision. Buy early and receive a DC Comics Collector's Edition Superman comic book. Superman, the New Adventures video game.
Incredibly, Superman 64 was a financial success, selling over 500,000 copies. Titus had also previously released a commercially successful Superman title for the Game Boy in 1997, and had a PlayStation Superman title on the horizon, the development of which they farmed out to Blue Sky Software. The PlayStation version was about 90% complete when, according to Khan, its release was blocked by Sony and Warner Brothers. But that's not exactly what happened. In fact, Sony had already issued a product code for the game and retailers were already taking pre-orders. What actually happened is that Titus' license simply expired towards the very end of development, and they weren't able to reach a new agreement with Warner Brothers. It's probably fair to say that if Warner Brothers hadn't constantly interfered in Superman 64's development, Titus would likely have had the license long enough to release Superman for the PlayStation. Supposedly, Warner Brothers expected Titus Software to file a lawsuit over the cancellation of the PlayStation title and had even begun taking steps to have a settlement offer ready. The lawsuit never came. What did come were years of negative reviews, internet memes, and a distinct honor of being placed on many worst games list. So, there you have it, the short and strange tale of the development of Superman 64. Warner Brothers made creating Superman 64 hell for Titus Software, and Titus, for their part, misled the public regarding the game's features up to the very end, cashing in on the hype and anticipation that they fabricated. So ultimately, the story of Superman 64 is a Superman story with no heroes, except for those gamers courageous enough to sit through and play it to the end.
In short time, your fate will be sealed, Superman.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please do consider subscribing and check out my gaming documentaries playlist. I post a new documentary about every 1 to 2 weeks. If you'd like to help my little channel grow, please consider sharing this video on Reddit or other social media. But again, most importantly, thank you for watching.